During World War I, the Japanese Empire was on the side of the Allies, capturing islands of the colonial German Empire in the South Pacific and fighting alongside the British and French in the siege of Tsingtao, modern Qingdao, in the Shandong province in China. Japanese casualties were 733 killed and 1,282 wounded. Great Britain 12 killed and 53 wounded, and Germany 199 killed and 504 wounded. After World War I, the Japanese Empire signed the Treaty of Versailles and was a member of the League of Nations. The Japanese Empire became a world power. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Japan, like most of the world, began to suffer hardships. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, which is rich in natural resources.
It occupied the whole of southern Manchuria, and shortly after, the whole country.
The Japanese staged an attack on one of its railways using dynamite. This event gave Japan their reason for the invasion. This started tensions between Japan and America and its allies. The Japanese public mostly supported the invasion since its resources helped the Japanese economy, but the Japanese army inflicted atrocities on Chinese civilians. The Great Depression caused panic across the world, leading to a rise in political chaos. The Japanese army took over power in Japan, and Hitler came to power in Germany. Fighting between Japan and China continued after the Manchuria invasion. America supported China, but did not intervene, believing it was not worth risking a war with Japan. In 1937, fighting between Japan and China erupted into a full-scale invasion of mainland China, kicking off the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Marco Polo Bridge incident gave Japan its reason for the full-scale invasion. The Japanese poured into China and reached Nanjing in December. The river gunboat USS Panay, a part of the Yangtze Patrol, was evacuating American citizens and journalists who were in Nanjing. December 12th, the USS Panay, along with 3 Standard Oil tankers, were a few miles from Nanjing. The tankers were there to help rescue Standard Oil employees' family members. The Japanese got intel that a group of Chinese ships were in the area, and they set off to attack with 3 Japanese bombers and 9 fighters. The USS Panay had 3 American flags flying clearly visible and had told the Japanese that they would be in the area, but the bombers either did not see or they ignored this information. The bombs battered the convoy, sinking the USS Panay and destroying the tankers. The fighters fired their machine guns on the ships and survivors, fleeing in the lifeboats and in the water. A reporter for the Times saw a small Japanese boat machine gunning the Panay. Survivors rushed ashore as the fighters circled, firing from above. It took days to rescue the survivors. On the Panay, 3 were killed, 43 enlisted, and 5 civilians were wounded. The Japanese claimed the attack was an accident and believed it was a Chinese fleet. The Japanese Empire paid the U.S. $2.2 million for damages, and they apologized. During the Nanjing battle, the Japanese soldiers massacred civilians in one of the worst atrocities in the Asian theater. Over 6 weeks, tens of thousands of women were assaulted. 20,000 male civilians were killed, who the Japanese thought were soldiers. Over 30,000 people were executed, and an estimated 200,000 civilians were brutally murdered. Entire villages were murdered. The Japanese rounded up women and assaulted them, and then murdered thousands. During the massacre, the event known as the Allison Incident increased tensions. John Allison, consul at the Nanjing American Embassy, was beaten by a Japanese soldier. The Japanese apologized, but the invasion into China, the USS Panay incident, and the Nanjing massacre had damaged the relationship between the United States and the Japanese Empire. In September 1940, Japan invaded French Indo-China to stop the flow of supplies into China. As a result of Japan's invasion, the U.S. set an embargo on scrap iron, steel, and aviation fuel. Germany was taking over Europe while Japan was fighting in China and invading Indochina. Germany invaded Poland in 1939. Norway, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg in 1940. The U.S. moved the Pacific Fleet to Hawaii in 1940 and sent more troops to the Philippines to try and send a message to Japan, allying themselves with Germany and Italy, forming the Axis powers. Japan invaded southern Indochina in July 1941. This caused the U.S. to freeze all of Japan's assets in America, and it stopped the sale of American oil and gas to Japan, which 80% of Japan's oil came from America. The U.S. warned Japan not to expand into any other neighboring country, or they would intervene. But Japan had a plan. They only had an estimated 2-year supply of oil, so they planned to invade the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. After the sanctions, the U.S. and Japan started negotiations to try to come to an agreement. Japan wanted the oil sanctions lifted and promised to pull out of Indochina as long as the Americans promised not to give aid to China. They went back and forth but could not come to an agreement. Japan had already been planning to attack Pearl Harbor, led by Admiral Yamamoto, if they could not reach an agreement. To keep America out of the Pacific, they would need rubber, oil, and food for their military in the coming invasions that they had planned in the Pacific, which they called the Southern Resource Area. Japan set off towards Pearl Harbor before they received America's final offer. The Japanese trained and even planned for the attack on Pearl Harbor, even though it had not been approved by Emperor Hirohito. The Japanese had planned a decisive battle. The battleships would be the pilots' main targets. They hoped to wipe the Pacific Fleet out in order to invade Southeast Asia without the Americans interfering. Then have enough time to build up their own fleet and get resources in time before the Americans could recover. The Japanese believed that America would go to war if they invaded much of Southeast Asia, and believed they needed to take out America so that they could not intervene. Japan would start their invasion the same time as their attack on Pearl Harbor, but America had done very little so far to Japan. Germany had control over many of America's allies in Europe and had not declared war on Germany. The Dutch East Indies were controlled by the Dutch, who were under rule of Germany, and Japan had attacked Americans in China already. It's possible that if Japan invaded Southeast Asia without attacking Pearl Harbor, America might have done very little to oppose them. The Japanese left Etorofu Island on November 26, 1941, headed towards Pearl Harbor. If the negotiations were successful, they would abort the mission, but they wanted to be ready just in case a compromise could not be made. They had 6 aircraft carriers with over 400 planes, but only 353 would be used in the attack. 40 torpedo planes, 103 level bombers, and 131 dive bombers. The rest of the fleet included 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 2 battleships, 9 destroyers, 8 tankers, 23 fleet submarines, and 5 midget submarines. The Japanese planned a first wave, second wave, and third wave, and a defensive patrol around the fleet. The Japanese had designed Type 91 aerial torpedoes, which could be dropped from the planes into shallow water, since Pearl Harbor had a maximum depth of just 60 feet. At 1 o'clock in the morning on December 7th, 5 submarines in the Japanese fleet, I-16, I-18, I-20, I-22, and I-24, all got ready to launch their midget submarines, and they would proceed to Pearl Harbor. Each midget sub had 2 Type 96 torpedoes, and they had 2 crew members in each sub. The minesweeper USS Condor was near the entrance of Pearl Harbor at 3:45 a.m. when Ensign Russell G. McCoy spotted a periscope wake in the water. At 3:57, the crew of the Condor signaled that she spotted a periscope to the destroyer USS Ward, who was also patrolling farther out at sea near the harbor. This submarine possibly made it into the harbor after the sighting. The anti-submarine nets were open when the sub was spotted. The USS Ward quickly searched the area but found nothing, believing it might have been one of their own submarines. At 6:10 a.m., the Japanese first wave took off from the aircraft carriers around 200 miles from Pearl Harbor, 183 planes in total. A PBY patrol plane spotted a submarine shortly before 7 a.m., trying to follow the cargo ship Antares into the harbor. The USS Ward had also spotted the submarine. She fired her No. 3 gun, hitting the conning tower of the sub. The submarine slowly went under. The Ward dropped depth charges over where she had sunk. An oil slick was observed. The USS Ward reported, "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon a submarine operating in defensive sea area." The Japanese cruisers Tone and Chikuma both launched reconnaissance float planes at 6:30. At 7:33, Tone's float plane reported that on Maui, Lahaina anchorage was empty. At 7:35, Chikuma's float plane reported no carriers, 9 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 6 light cruisers were in port on Oahu. Private Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott were manning a vehicle-mounted radar station at Opana Radar Site. Their shift was supposed to be over at 7 a.m., but at 7:02, a massive radar signature appeared, a large number of planes, 132 miles away. Lockard could not reach his supervisor, so Elliott called Fort Shafter. Private Joseph McDonald answered and heard the news. He thought he was alone at the intercept center, and he did not know what to do. The phone suddenly disconnected. McDonald later found Lieutenant Kermit Taylor, and he told about the large amount of planes, but the lieutenant brushed it off. McDonald told the lieutenant again, who claimed it was most likely a group of B-17s that they were expecting. Lockard spoke to the lieutenant directly, who told him not to worry. At 7:05 a.m., the planes from the Japanese second wave took off from the aircraft carriers. Japan's first wave of 103 planes reached Oahu at around 7:40 a.m., and they separated into 3 groups for their separate attacks. A flare signaled the Japanese attack. They all attacked at once. The loud roar of 183 Japanese aircraft filled Pearl Harbor. Everyone that was awake looked up to see the astonishing sight. The skies were filled with aircraft on a Sunday morning. Military personnel and civilians alike witnessed the Japanese planes and were confused. It wasn't until the first bombs were dropped when people realized Pearl Harbor was under attack. Many awoke to the sounds of explosions, gunfire, and dive bombers. Military personnel ran to see what was happening, and then they rushed to their stations. The Americans had grouped all of their planes together so that they could be guarded easier on the airfields in an attempt to stop sabotage. Hawaii had a large Japanese population, and commanders feared sabotage the most. Most of the ammunition was also locked away for the same reason. The American planes grouped together made easy targets for the Japanese fighters. 188 American aircraft were completely destroyed. At Battleship Row, the USS Oklahoma at berth F5 next to the USS Maryland was hit by 2 torpedoes shortly after the attack started. A 3rd torpedo broke through the hull a few minutes after she began to list to port, and more torpedoes struck the wounded ship. She capsized, and men tried to escape into the water. They were strafed as they swam for cover. Many died in the water that day. Others climbed onto the Maryland and helped the anti-aircraft crews fire at the incoming planes. 429 men were killed in the sinking of the Oklahoma. Shortly after 8 a.m., a group of Nakajima torpedo bombers set their sights on the USS Arizona, flying at 3,000 feet. She was struck 4 times by the bombers, 1 hit by Turret 2. The magazines were directly below and exploded violently a few seconds after the bombs hit. The front of the ship was ripped apart, causing the conning tower and funnel to collapse. 1,177 men on board the USS Arizona were killed in the attack, ripped apart by the explosions or trapped in the sinking ship. The USS West Virginia was moored alongside the USS Tennessee. The torpedo bombers targeted her port side. She was hit repeatedly by torpedoes, 7 in total. The bombers hit her port side, and then her ammo in the casemates caught fire. Another bomb hit a turret on the rear end of the ship. She was listing badly, but her group, led by Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, flooded the other side of the ship, causing her to go down even, and the hull rested on the bottom of the harbor. Severe fires were started from leaking oil and fuel. Oil fires from the Arizona spread into the water and burned the West Virginia even more. 106 men died on board the West Virginia. The USS California engaged the Japanese airplane shortly after the initial attack. Some of her guns were readied at the time of the attack, but they had little ammunition. The rest was locked in the magazines. She was struck by 2 torpedoes dropped by the Nakajima torpedo bombers. All her watertight doors and most of her portholes were open at the time of the attack because she was waiting for an inspection. The flooding water from the torpedoes spread throughout the ship. She started to list a port. The crew tried to flood the starboard side, but the ship lost power. She was hit over and over by dive bombers. Fire spread throughout the ship, but she stayed afloat for now. She slowly hit bottom when the water could not be pumped out fast enough over the next few days. 104 men died on board the USS California. USS Nevada's band had been waiting on deck to play as the colors were raised when the attack started. She was behind the USS Arizona, but was not next to any other battleships. Earlier in the day, a second boiler was lit. The crew started to build steam once the Japanese attacked. She was struck by a torpedo and was taking on water at 8:10, but it was not as bad as the other ships. The crew managed to keep her level with counter-flooding. Her crew began fighting back, shooting down numerous Japanese airplanes. She was able to get underway at 8:40 a.m. and headed out of Battleship Row. The Japanese began targeting the moving ship, trying to sink her. She was hit repeatedly at 9:50 a.m. She was hit by 5 bombs, causing fires from leaking gasoline. She was ordered to ground, so she did not sink in the deep water. At 10:30, she grounded at Hospital Point. 60 men were killed on board the USS Nevada. The flagship USS Pennsylvania was in dry dock next to the destroyers USS Cason and USS Downs. Her crew went to battle stations and fired on the attacking Japanese. At 8:30, the bombers began attacking the ships. Fire spread throughout the dry docks, and it was flooded to keep the flames at bay. The Downs exploded. Her torpedo tube crashed into the Pennsylvania. She suffered 15 men dead and 14 missing. The USS Maryland was moored next to the USS Oklahoma. Many of her crew were preparing for shore leave. Her crew went to their battle stations and began firing on the Japanese. When the Oklahoma capsized, many from her crew climbed onto the Maryland and helped the anti-aircraft crews. 2 bombs hit the Maryland, causing little damage compared to the rest of the fleet. After repairs, she went back into service by June 1942. 4 men died on board the Maryland during the attack. The USS Tennessee was moored next to the West Virginia. The Tennessee's anti-aircraft guns were readied shortly after the initial attack. The Tennessee was trapped due to the damaged battleships around her, so she could not get underway. She was strafed repeatedly that morning, and when the Arizona exploded, fire surrounded the ship. She was hit by 2 bombs around 8:20 a.m., but one did not detonate properly. After repairs, she was back in service in February 1942. 5 men were killed on board the USS Tennessee. Many other ships were sunk and damaged during the attack, along with countless military personnel and civilians. The Japanese had successfully attacked with 2 waves. The second wave arrived at 8:45 a.m., and at 9:45 the attack was over. The Japanese had lost 29 planes in the attack and 5 midget submarines. 55 men were killed, most during the second wave, after the Americans had been prepared for battle. 1 man was captured, Kazu Sakamaki, the only survivor from the 10 crew members of the 5 midget submarines. He was the first prisoner of war by the Americans in World War II. The planes arrived at the Japanese fleet, and it was decided that a 3rd wave would not be sent out. The commander, Admiral Nagumo, did not want to lose any more men or any of his ships. Every ship was safe except the 5 midget submarines. Other targets were supposed to be hit that day, but they were not hit in the first 2 waves. The submarines, the Navy Yard, and most importantly, the oil storage tanks. An estimated 4.5 million barrels of oil was stored, and it was supposed to be hit last by the Japanese to prevent smoke from blocking the view of the Japanese pilots. Some believe that America may not have been ready for war until 1943 if the Japanese had destroyed the oil tanks that day. 2,403 people died at Pearl Harbor, including 68 civilians. 1,178 were wounded. The attack united America and enraged nearly every American, the opposite of what the Japanese intended. They thought it would stop America from interfering in their Southeast Asian invasions. Instead, it woke a sleeping giant. Thank you for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope I did Pearl Harbor a little bit of justice. It was a little difficult to find all of the details about the attack that day on the ships, but hopefully I did alright. Thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.